Okay. I warned everyone that I was going to look progressively worse as this kept going. Although I think my camera makes me look a lot worse than I actually am. But yeah, it's like day 4 or 5 without a shower. But it's whatever. City has issued a boil water notice still, so it's all bottles. It's the only safe thing to drink. So, I don't know. Technically, you could shower in it. I think I'm going to snap and shower in it tonight. I don't know. Something like in my inner germophobia is like somehow, I don't know, opposed to that, even though they technically say it's fine for bathing in. If it's not good for me to drink, why would I want to like rub it all over my body? I don't know. So anyway, I was going to talk about Michel's again. We're on installment number 3. But I mentioned like wanting to talk about some other things. And it was just like one random thought that I had that's really apropos of nothing that I was going to start this out with. And that is that, so this whole ice storm that hit Texas, that shut down the power grid, that basically led to the water being turned off because a lot of the water treatment plants lost power. That was the first and foremost reason why they were turned off. But also they lost pressure because a bunch of pipes burst. Some of that can't be prevented. Some of it could have been prevented. And there's a lot of finger pointing now and people wondering, like, our head's going to roll. Are we going to hold people accountable for this? Because holding people accountable seems to be like the coin of the realm these days. I don't know. Not that I'm against holding people accountable, I guess, for things that they may have done wrong or been irresponsible, but it's not. There's something to be said for the attitude of wanting to move forward and find solutions and figure out what was wrong and fix that, rather than fixating on who to blame and all that jazz, because it's very cathartic and it makes us feel very good to find who's to blame and for heads to roll and feel like that's done something, but that really hasn't done anything. That being said, there is also there's a bad incentive that you create if you allow people who have committed crimes or abused their power while in office to get away scot-free, because then you're sending the message that you will get away with that, which will produce more bad behavior in the future. I think it was Nietzsche who said, a wise man punishes not because people have done wrong, but because they won't do wrong in the future. I totally butchered that, but he said a wise man punishes not because people have done bad things. You're not getting vengeance. He's advocating for deterrence. So I understand that whole argument. But I want to leave all that aside because none of that matters, because none of us have any real power to affect change other than like when we can go vote or whatever. And I guess what I want to bring up is like people like Ted Cruz like leaving the state in the middle of the snowstorm. If you don't know, he like left with his family to go to Cancun. And then there's all these takes about this. And he said a million different explanations of like, it was a spur of the moment trip. And then he said, oh, well, it was a pre-planned trip and we couldn't cancel it. I didn't want to, and then he said, it was just my family going. It was just my daughters going. They had this plan and I was just going with him. I was always planning on coming back, blah, blah, blah. It's whatever, man. You just wanted to fucking go to Cancun. I fucking get it. Just be upfront about that. You fucked up. Everyone knows that you were just going to go to Cancun in the middle of an ice storm while like your constituents are freezing and fucking starving and have no water or whatever. Whatever. You were completely self-interested and you were thinking, let me get the fuck out of here and go to Cancun, but you got caught and then you had to come back. Whatever. That's more or less what I'm convinced happened. The issue is now, though, I guess the reason why I brought up lost ideas of leadership, which is, I guess, a weird way of putting it, is that I've had a couple conservative friends tell me, well, what could Ted Cruz have done? What did you want him to do? There's nothing in his federal office that would have actually helped during this disaster. He's not in charge of the disaster relief. He's not, him being here doesn't do anything for anybody. It's unproductive. It's basically just why should he have to suffer? What does it do for other people for him suffering? That he doesn't alleviate their suffering by him being here. Why can't he go to Cancun? If you had it, you would do it too. If you had the means to go to Cancun, you would have gone there too. And that's true, by the way. And I did see someone say this is how all the rich are going to behave as climate change accelerates. That's absolutely true. Anyone who has means, they're just going to fucking leave. And why wouldn't you? I mean, if you see the cataclysm coming and you have the ability to get away, you get away. That's so. But okay, so what am I talking about here? What I'm talking about is that's not what a fucking leader does. And it doesn't matter if the leader can't technically do anything or them being there doesn't improve the situation. It improves it by the fact that they're suffering with you in solidarity. Like a good general leads from the front. The military fucking, understood this. I mean, I guess once upon a time they did, because now the armchair general is the typical general. But in the old days, I mean, I guess that's why it's a lost idea. In the old days, the general did lead from the front. And you did expect that, like, the people that you've invested with your trust and who are in charge of the community would be willing to suffer with you if some, heinous catastrophe happens. And no, that doesn't technically do anything to improve the situation. But it's like, I just think about it in terms of, like, let's say that you're in a situation where, what is it? Like, just in the same situation, but it's just you and your family, and you have one ticket to leave, and the rest of your family is going to stay there and suffer, and you're the head of the house. Like, do you do it? I mean, technically, you're not alleviating their suffering by staying with them, but that's just what you do with your family, right? That tie of blood means that you stay and you deal with that hardship with them. And I think what a lot of conservatives, though, and this is maybe the interesting insight, genuinely do not think about leadership anymore like that in terms of, like, government. They don't think that is how you should regard politicians. And maybe they're correct, but they think that basically there's nothing noble about, like, political office. There's nothing noble about government. And therefore, we shouldn't expect these people to be noble. And so when they behave in an ignoble way, you shouldn't be surprised. And by the way, it's not going to fucking help you anyway. So why do you give a shit? And I guess without taking a position for or against, I mean, no, I'll take a position. I think that's bullshit. I think the leader should lead from the front to be a real leader. But I would admit there's none of that leadership going on currently in the country at all. There just isn't. And because the attitude is, like, when United States senators get the information, for example, last year, that there's a massive pandemic coming, what do? Is they sell their stock options. So they did insider trading to, try and profit off the fact that the U.S. economy was about to tank. So, and that was both sides. That was everyone. And that is how, I mean, I don't know. There is a real politique angle where the conservatives correct. You should see politicians for what they are. You should see the government for what it is. Don't have these romantic notions, because these people will not lead from the front. I understand all that, and I'm all for being realistic. But at the same time, that's why I wish, I don't know, just for me, every fucking bone in my body, every cell tells me, like, fuck that weaselly piece of shit. Fuck that motherfucker for leaving the state in the middle of this. And that's like, that to me is like, I don't know. That's my takeaway from all this. It has nothing to do with, like, policy prescriptions or anything of that nature, because none of that matters what my opinions on that are. It's just, yet again, to point out how shitty and low quality our leaders are across the board. So speaking of leaders, since we are getting to that chapter now in Michel's, ignoble is a great word. We're on to part 2, which is called the autocratic tendencies of leaders. And so, as I kind of talked about it last time, the first couple parts of Michel's that we covered is Michel's kind of explaining why, even in egalitarian or democratic movements, you have oligarchies form. What are the social factors that cause that? and make it almost inevitable that that will always happen. And then the section 2 that we covered, it was the psychological realities that produce that make that attractive to people, of why the masses want a leader and why the leaders want to lead. And then so in the autocratic tendencies of leaders, what Michel talks about is basically the mechanisms that the leaders then have available to them that solidify their position, that make this not just simply an expedient reality of the moment that you need temporarily a leader, right? Or that it's effective. You form leadership just as a, like the famous 5-year plans of the Soviets, or the idea that you need a temporary dictatorship of the proletariat, but eventually it gives way to egalitarianism. A lot of what this part is talking about the mechanisms that actually preserve and entrench leadership within democratic and socialist party structures. And so it starts out with chapter 1, which is the stability of leadership. And the beginning sentence is, no one who studies the history of the socialist movement in Germany can fail to be greatly struck by the stability of the group of persons leading the party. I'm going to gloss over a lot of this, but I'll just get right into what his finding is, or some of the evidence that he presents. This is on page 119. The author has examined the lists of those present at the congresses held in 1893 by 3 of the international socialist parties, namely the German Social Democrats, the Parti Ouvrier. I've already said I don't speak French and I can't pronounce French. I can usually fumble through some German or Spanish or Italian, but French, it's it really is a barbaric language. And I know there were some comments on the Discord server of people talking smack about France. I think that's all completely justified. It's not a joke. Anyway, so it was the Parti Ouvrier, the German Social Democrats, the Italian Socialist Party. In order to ascertain the names of those who in the year 1910 were still in the first rank of the fighters on behalf of socialism in their respective countries. The results of this inquiry, which cannot claim absolute scientific precision, which have nonetheless considerable practical value, are as follows. Of the 200 delegates to the Congress of Cologne, 60 were still fighting in the breach of 1910. Of the 93 delegates of the Congress of Paris, 12. And of the 311 delegates to the Congress of Reggio Emilia, 102. It shows a very high percentage of survivals, above all for the proletarian parties of Italy and Germany, but to a lesser extent for the Parti Ouvrier. The bourgeois parties of the left on the continent will hardly find it possible to boast of a similar continuity in the personnel of their leaders, great and small. In the working class parties, we find that the personnel of the officials is even more stable than that of the leaders in general. The causes of this stability, as will be shown in the sequel, depend upon a complex of numerous phenomena. And, man, okay. So, man, there's another section that's really fucking good. Ties into the same chapter, where he says, okay, it has been calculated that in the German Empire, the average official life of a minister of state is 4 years and 3 months. In the leadership, that is to say, in the ministry of the Socialist Party, we see the same persons occupying the same post for 40 years in succession. Naumann writes of the Democratic parties, quote, here changes in the leading offices occur less rapidly than in those of the secretaries of state and the ministers. The democratic method of election has its own peculiar loyalty. As far as individual details are concerned, it is incalculable, and yet on general lines we can count upon its activity with more certainty than upon the policy of princes. So what he's saying here is that the ministerial positions under the monarchical government, they had more cycling through of their people actually making the decisions, controlling the bureaucracies of government. Those people had a higher rate of attrition than in democratic political parties and socialist political parties, where people are being elected. They're not just being appointed by a prince, but the prince is more, like, as he says, also the prince, the the way the masses vote and the way the parties vote and who they're going to vote for is more reliable than following the whims of the princes. There is a higher incumbency rate when you allow these Democratic Party structures to elect their own leaders. And I said I'd be like talking about contemporary U.S. politics as we got into this, but Jesus Christ, I mean, how do you not hear that and think immediately of like Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, Dianne Feinstein, Mitch McConnell with his fucking hands rotting off of his body, Nancy Pelosi's like dentures fall out of her mouth when she fucking talks. She looks like a living mummy with her skin stretched taut by years of plastic surgery. I mean, we just elected the oldest president ever to be elected, who is succeeding Trump, who was the oldest president ever to be elected. Our current president most likely has dementia. And people have, when you look at like the leadership of even the tail end of the old Soviet Union and how old and sclerotic and stagnant their leadership was, it is even worse now in America. We have older, no, it's not ageism. Come on. If your grandma gets to be fucking a certain age, the doctor will say you shouldn't be driving anymore because your eyesight has gone bad. Similar things happen in your mind. If you have dementia, you shouldn't be given the nuclear football. So no, it's not. I know, and I know you're probably joking. I don't know who this is. I'm gonna guess it's Kohei, but maybe not. Or Oles. I'm gonna guess it's Oles. But it's not ageism because even if that is a joke, because we're talking about who's controlling the levers of power. But more importantly than ageism, it's not just that these people are like physically very old. It's the fact that, like, how do you put it? They got into these high positions of power and then held them for decades and decades and decades. So to the point where they should have stepped down after a reasonable age. And here they still are holding on to their power. And they keep getting reliably voted. I guess part of why this is also very, very apropos of the moment is because there was just a big controversy among the Democratic Party of reelecting Nancy Pelosi as Speaker, which you can set your watch by it that they're going to do that. Even though you have this like supposedly radical left flank in the Democratic Party and you have these like center-right Democrats and there's supposedly this broad coalition but no, they always just elect the same person over and over and over again. And so there was a big controversy because there was a big push from the grassroots. You should withhold your vote from Pelosi because now there are enough people in the squad or the progressive, there's like 7 or 8 Democrats who are like socialists in Congress or like democratic socialists, or whatever the fuck they want to call themselves, where they claim to be like dissidents within the party who are going to change the party and push it left. So there was a thing called force the vote. You should force Nancy Pelosi to give you some concession before you vote for her. And this was roundly rejected by like the entire left-wing like media sphere and like half of the alt media sphere as well. They were like, no, you can't do that. We have to stick with Pelosi because it would be the worst possible thing if the Republicans got to be Speaker of the House, which probably wouldn't happen due to the formalities. But it was just interesting to me, like reading this, because here we are again talking about, okay, these same people get elected over and over again, and you can't, like, their power is so entrenched and it's more reliable what that Democratic body is going to do. Like I already knew I knew they were going to vote for her again because they always do. Versus the fact that it should be embarrassing that in a monarchy they actually have more turnover and the prince could be maybe more relied on to, like, if you fuck up. Like I remember reading it was like in the lead up to World War II, like the Japanese emperor, I believe, was just told, like, the prime minister, I don't remember which one of the, but he just like sat him down. He's like, don't you think you should resign? Come on, you messed up. You fucked up bad. You'd fucked up in some way. And so that would just happen. The monarch would just say, like, okay, you've lost face. You must leave now. Whereas our leaders, no, that doesn't happen. And so I guess we'll get into talking about more why that doesn't happen in this chapter. Another aside, he says, this is on page 120. It has been calculated that every American citizen must okay, let me back up a little bit. If we take into account the number of offices to be filled by universal suffrage and the frequency of elections, The American citizen is the one who enjoys the largest measure of democracy. So, go America. His evidence for this, though, is a little specious. He says, in the United States, not only the legislative bodies, but all the higher administrative and judicial offices are elected by popular vote. So that's not true. Not all the higher judicial offices are. And I, even when Michel was writing, I don't think there was ever a time when we directly elected like Supreme Court justices. And then he says, it has been calculated that every American citizen must, on an average, exercise his function as a voter 22 times a year. That's not true. And that's where I'm like, because of the times, I'm like, maybe that's true, but no, there's no fucking way that's true, because I've seen Americans, and there are Americans now, but most of them can't be bothered to vote once, not only once a year, they can't be bothered to vote once in 4 years. So this idea that there's a bunch of Americans voting in any number 22 times a year, I don't think that ever happened. Especially when you had to like get there by like horse cart. I don't think they were doing that. So calls into question the veracity of this whole book, really. Okay. So I mean, this is a good point. On 121, he says, leadership is indefinitely retained, not because it is the tangible expression of the relationship between forces existing in the party at any given moment, but simply because it is already constituted. It's that status quo bias. It is through gregarious idleness, or if we may employ the euphemism, it is in virtue of the law of inertia that leaders are so often confirmed in their office as long as they like. The re-election demanded by the rules, this is page 122, becomes a pure formality. The temporary commission becomes a permanent one, and the tenure of office an established right. So let's move on a little more. So he gives some reasons. Again, these are not his. He doesn't number these. I went through my notes and kind of numbered the reasons that he gives, but he gives like 3 reasons why the leaders stay in power that are structural in this chapter. There's so for one, there's the leader's sense of prestige and the sense among not just themselves, but among the party officials and the rank and file that person deserves it. We can all probably see this in political parties to this very day. The second thing is indispensability. So that we talked about that a lot last time, but that comes with the hierarchy of specialized labor within the party. You divide the labor, you have all these specialists, certain people become really good at it. And so if you groom a very good politician and they become indispensable to you because they are winning seats, you don't want to part with them. You don't want to, you don't want to do a primary challenge or anything like that. And then the third main reason is that he says, just for the sake of being effective, that too short of a term limit is crippling, that they can't do anything. What does he say? Appointment to office for short terms is democratic, but is quite unpractical, like on technical and psychological grounds, since it fails to arouse in the employee a proper sense of responsibility. It throws the door open to administrative anarchy. Where the ministers are changed every few months, everyone who attains to power thinks chiefly of making a profitable use of that power while it lasts. Which I think that's like, how could that not be true? I think he's dead on there. I mean, you don't have, even at a job I worked, how do I talk about this in terms so I don't like talk about the company? Just when you have people, without going into specifics, when you have people who are not specially trained for one task and doing that all the time, and they kind of like go from job to job, sometimes they're not invested in any particular one thing enough to really like care about it. And so if when you're going in, if you have these extremely limited terms and you're going in like, I'm only going to be here for a year or 6 months or whatever, how seriously will you really take that job? And how's that going to affect? Are you just going to say, I'm going to use this power while I have it? Because I mean, we know, for example, that lame duck presidents versus ones that stand to be reelected behave differently. What is it here? Rotation in office, as the Americans call it, no doubt corresponds to the principle, or the pure principle of democracy. Up to a certain point, it is adapted to check the formation of a bureaucratic spirit of caste. But this advantage is more than compensated by the exploitive methods of ephemeral leaders, with all of their disastrous consequences. On the other hand, one of the greatest advantages of monarchy is that the hereditary prince, having an eye to the interests of his children and his successors, possesses an objective and permanent interest in his position, and almost always abstains from policy which would hopelessly impair the vital energies of his country, just as the landed proprietor usually rejects method of cultivation which, while providing large immediate returns, would sterilize the soil to the detriment of his heirs. That is a perfect example, because again, historically, political power, or holding the levers of political power, was a sort of heritable property right that you could pass on to your children. And so he brings up the idea of like tending your land, which was also heritable property, and that you would, with an eye to future generations, not want to just use some sort of agricultural technique to gain a bunch of immediate profit, but then fuck over all of your descendants. And this is the same reason why Nietzsche brings up an idea that he says, if you want democracy to work, you should keep in mind that only people who have children should be allowed to determine the course of your country's future, because they're the only ones who really have a future beyond themselves in this ephemeral life, because an individual human life is incredibly ephemeral. People come and go, leaders come and go, presidents come and go, kings come and go. But the polity itself, you want as much permanence for that as you could possibly have. And so he basically says you shouldn't enfranchise anybody who doesn't have kids. So that's just, interesting. So somebody, what is it? Does Michel's believe that true democracy is impossible, says the anti-philosopher, which I believe is Matt from Beyond Talking Points. I don't know, but I would lean towards yes. In terms of like true democracy, I think yes. He would say it always, that the line between aristocracy and democracy is mostly one of aesthetic trappings and things of that nature, and that you always regress towards an oligarchy. That maybe you can introduce more and more democratic limitations, but the more you do that, the more you weaken yourself. And so that's kind of the way that he sees that relationship playing out. On page 126, so we have these three forces of the idea of people, why these leaders stay in power. They gain a sense of prestige and fame. People say they deserve it. They become indispensable to the cause. So they say, well, how can we get rid of them? And they say, he has to have a long amount of time in office to be effective, to do anything. And so with this, page 126, he says, in proportion as the chiefs become detached from the mass, they show themselves more and more inclined, when gaps in their own ranks have to be filled, to effect this not by way of popular election, but by co-optation, and also to increase their own effectiveness wherever possible by creating new posts upon their own initiative. So Caesar did that a lot. To use an example from the Roman Republic, like he added, I want to say like it was more than 100, it might have even been 200 new senators that, of course, he got to appoint all of them. And then he appointed a lot of them from like provinces of Gaul where he had a lot of friends and allies, and from like provinces that were, where there were a bunch of his, just like that allowed him to appoint a bunch of posts that were loyal to him. Further down, there arises in the leaders a tendency to isolate themselves, to form a sort of cartel, and to surround themselves, as it were, with a wall, within which they will admit those only who are of their own way of thinking. Instead of allowing their successors to be appointed by the choice of the rank and file, the leaders do all in their power to choose these successors for themselves, and to fill up gaps in their own ranks directly or indirectly by the exercise of their own volition. So that's like the idea of like building a sort of like clique around yourself, that you Which, we see that now with, like, what would be a good example in modern, like, democratic politics? Like, in the Democratic Party, there's the DLC, the Democratic Leadership Council. That was a group that Bill Clinton came out of. He was their rock star, obviously, because he actually got elected, which is the most important thing. And Barack Obama was very much, I mean, he ran against Hillary Clinton, but part of how he was able to be so effective and unite was by unifying with the Clinton wing. And the Clinton wing of the party has been sort of like the kingmakers for the past, 20, 30 years. And so there's like a little clique of like the party royalty, so to speak, who share a lot of the same ideas. A lot of that was true in the Republican Party. Trump has kind of fucked all that up, and they're in a civil war right now. So that's all very fun to watch. So chapter 2, I just want to get this in. I miss Trump so much, y'all. I really do. I love saying things that'll just get me canceled immediately, but I just, funniest president we've ever had. I know I say it all the time, but it's like he's just gone. Like suddenly he's like ghosted off Twitter. He got dusted, and then he's not president anymore. There was the kind of weak tea of the impeachment, but I'm just used to having a steady feed of comedy that's not there anymore, and it's kind of sad. And it's like his son is such a fucking like fail kid, like piece of shit who will never be as funny and never be as good of a poster as his dad was. He has that saying, he's trying to be like a meme guy or whatever, but he sucks at it. Okay, so chapter 2, financial power of the leaders in the party. So this is a discussion of how he specifically uses the German socialist parties. The leadership maintains control via power of the purse, which that's all fairly self-explanatory. Like DCCC, I forget what that all stands for, but like they control the purse for running Democratic candidates elections, and they notably have a policy that they will always support incumbents against primary challengers. So that's sort of closing up your ranks of people who are existing incumbents. Very bizarre. Like it doesn't allow your party to have a correction mechanism for when your leadership becomes old and sclerotic, which is exactly what's happened. But by maintaining control of the power of the purse, you prevent Trump from happening to your own party, which they don't want that to fucking happen. They successfully blocked Bernie Sanders from doing that. So that shows you how they're able to circle the wagons. But what he's really talking about here is not just like, okay, the party controls the power of the purse, money is power. This is one of my favorite chapters because it's like a catch-22 and there's no clear answer. Because he kind of outlines two different ways you can do it. You can be a socialist party where you say everyone's going to do everything by voluntarism. So you're not going to be paid, but everyone, we'll all take care of each other, or whatever needs need to be taken care of. But you're not going to draw a wage. This is all free labor that we're pooling in. That kind of thing. Or the party can say, because that would be sort of like, we're not going to participate in capitalism. We're not going to be, try and behave as a corporation and make money and pay out party members. But then the other idea is, well, no, to survive in capitalism, you need money. Like that's basic. That money is being able to direct the flow of resources, and first and foremost to yourself, so you don't starve. And so, people who are, struggling for world revolution or whatever, they are going to need to be paid. So the party should take care of them. So those are two kind of different attitudes. So he talks about the German Socialist Party. He talks about how they're very difficult. They're notoriously difficult to corrupt. And he cites a couple people praising the German socialists, even among the reactionaries, and saying these people are very idealistic and they actually believe what they say. But he says the unshaken fidelity of the German socialist leaders rests upon powerful reasons, and some of these are ideal in nature. This is on page 135. This attachment to the party, often manifested by fine and moving action, certainly represents one of the most solid elements and the foundation upon which has been erected the edifice of German socialism. But further down on the same page, he says, these ideal motives are reinforced by motives no less important of a material order. The practice of paying for services rendered to the party by its employees creates a bond which many of the comrades hesitate to break for 1,000 reasons. The pecuniary remuneration, it's kind of a tongue twister, for services to the party, which is given by the German social democracy, immunizes the party employees against the grosser forms of temptation. And so he says, whereas in France, England, Holland, Italy, and elsewhere, socialist propaganda spoken and written is affected chiefly by volunteers, and the German Socialist Party, gratuitous propaganda is practically unknown. So he basically says, he goes into detail of how, what is it? He's like, I'm not saying there's no unpaid work. Some, unpaid work happens. But in general, everyone is on the payroll of the party. But what does that do? I mean, if you just think about it for 2 seconds, that makes the party your employer. Which, if you're a socialist, that's a coercive relationship, right? I mean, like, if your goal is to seize the means of production because capitalism is exploitative, why is it exploitative? It's exploitative because people are not working out of a sense of like fulfillment and a voluntary desire to give up their labor for a cause they believe in. They're working to feed themselves. And they wouldn't have to do that if it wasn't coerced, that wasn't held over their head that you can't feed yourself unless you work. And obviously that's a fact of life. We all have to labor in order to get what we need to survive, but that they're alienated from having any say over the conditions of their work, or, like they're basically they've lost their autonomy and sense of self-sufficiency and are completely the wage slave of a corporation. So if that's like one of the central critiques of capitalism, there is sort of a contradiction with the party becoming your employer, because that puts you in the same coercive relationship to your party, where in the same way that you would be afraid to, say what you really mean or talk smack to your fucking boss, or like key his car or fucking let all the air out of his tires. These are all suggestions that you should do. Don't really know. It's a joke. It's a joke. The Frenchman thing was not a joke, but brie eating surrender monkeys, I really have a big problem with them. But in any case, you can't just decide to stop coming to work. You can't decide to, do your job the way you want to do it, not the way that your boss wants you to do it. You can't show up late every day or set your own schedule. And the same would be true of work and party life. You enter a coercive relationship where they are now exploiting you and controlling you. And so that's my socialist critique of this socialist party. But okay, so he says, in general, it's page 137, the German practice is to pay for all services to the party, from the most trifling notice contributed to a newspaper to the lengthiest public discourse. Whilst this deprives the party to a large extent of the spirit of heroism and enthusiasm, and of work done by voluntary and spontaneous collaboration, it gives to the organization a remarkable cohesion and an authority over the personnel, which, though doubtless detracting from its elasticity and its spirit of initiative, and in essence tending to impair the very socialist mentality, constitutes nonetheless one of the most important and indispensable bases of party life. And so the fact that they paid everyone is one of the things that strengthened the German Socialist Party. It made them relatively immune to corruption. It made everyone very loyal without having to rely on propaganda or just individual gumption, which as anyone learns, especially as they get older, it's is a exhaustible resource that can be unpredictable. And as we talked about in the last one, the masses can be incredibly apathetic, even when it comes to existential issues. And I don't know. I'm kind of reminded, I'm going to quote a conservative here, but Thomas Sowell said that there's no solutions, there's only trade-offs, basically. because it seems like you're either way you go. If you pay your people, you don't pay them. There's downside. So let's go. Keep going here. Oh, okay. Well, so and then on the other side of it, so he says on 139. In aristocratic regimes, so long at least as the aristocracy retains its essentially plutocratic character, the elected officials are usually unpaid. Their functions are purely honorary, even when they require the whole time of those who undertake them. They are members of the dominant class, are assumed to be rich, to make it a point of honor to spend money for the public good, and to occupy, even at considerable pecuniary sacrifice, eminent positions in the service of the state. Similar practice prevails even in modern democracies. The Lord Mayor of London and his colleagues in other great cities of England are unpaid. Same is true of the Italian syndics. So yeah, I mean in America as well, a lot of like positions for elected officials, they're not unpaid, but they pay you like it's not very much money. Like when you look into it, like what even a U.S. congressman makes is not that much money. Now, some of these people become millionaires while in office, which should tell you something, but they don't actually make that much money in their salary, and that's supposed to. I've heard the explanation. You don't want to, for one, it's like that American spirit of like we don't want to spend too much tax money paying out these elected officials, but it's also. You don't want people to be motivated to seek office just for the financial gain. Like if you became a millionaire from being a congressperson, how many people would do it just for the money? But then the downside of that is, okay, if it's not for the money, the only people who are going to do this are people who are already rich because it costs so much to run and it costs so much like personal energy and self-sacrifice. So, and then in practice, the people who do occupy those offices typically are very rich and well off. So that is the more aristocratic model, is actually unpaid work, because people who are rich can do unpaid work. Same thing with like our whole infrastructure in of moving people up into the middle class, of getting professional jobs within the bureaucracy. The unpaid internship, who's that for? That's for rich kids. That's who can take an unpaid internship. And so that kind of thing is crippling for, if you were just struggling to make ends meet, like how are you going to take an unpaid internship? That would be insane. So let's see here. He says, a party which has a well-filled treasury is in a position not only to dispense with the material aid of its comparatively affluent members, and thus to prevent the acquirement of those of a preponderant influence in the party, but also to provide itself with a body of officials who are loyal and devoted because they are entirely dependent on the party for their means of subsistence. He also has another note here on page 143. Speaking generally, when the manual workers become employers, it is not found that they are easy masters. They are prone to mistrust and are extremely exacting, which I believe it. I believe it. Okay. Trying to find a way to wrap up this chapter. Okay, so man, this is a really long paragraph. I don't want to read the whole thing, but I'm trying to pick out a choice bit. Let's see here. In the history of Christianity, we learn that as the wealth of the church increased, there increased also the independence of the clergy, of the ecclesiastical employees vis-a-vis the community. As representatives of the community, they were in charge of the goods. Consequently, all those who had need of these goods or wished in any way to speculate upon them were dependent upon the clergy. This applied not only to the mendicants and to all kinds of receivers of alms, but also those whose aim it was to swell the ranks of the clergy, or to succeed the positions of all these, the aspirants to sacerdotal honors. For the administration of the funds and for the conduct of affairs, Christianity needed a graded corps of employees. This was the origin of the hierarchy, which changed the inner meaning of Christianity and perverted its aims. So he and what he says, a similar danger is encountered by all democratic parties which possess an elaborate financial administration. Danger is especially marked in the case of the German Socialist Party. So even the holy rollers, people who form an organization not to gain political power, but for for the spiritual, the maintenance of the human soul, and the deepest spiritual and philosophical questions. And his assessment of why the Catholic Church basically became corrupted became the kind of thing that Luther would nail his grievances to the door of, the organization that would inspire such protest, because again, Protestant means one who is in protest, Protestant of the existent church, which, pretty funny when you think of how boring and reactionary like most Protestants are today. But they were in protest of the one Catholic Church, and his assessment is that was their. It wasn't just the fact that they got gold and got greedy. That's the thing that's like this very like one-dimensional analysis of it. It's not just they got greedy, it's that they had to maintain this like financial bureaucracy. And then like you have now these clerics who become clerks who are in control of the flow of coin, and what kind of power that gives you over the destinies of other men within your organization who now depend upon you, in the same sort of relationship that an employee has to an employer. And so the church became an employer. He's saying that that's what corrupted it, was capitalism. And so I love that analysis because, capitalism, it's like acid. It dissolves everything. I know. Protestants can be naughty, says the chat. And it's true. I mean, Catholics can be naughty too, as we found out in recent years. Not in a good way. Okay, chapter 3, Leaders in the Press. This is a pretty self-explanatory chapter. He basically says that the press constitutes a potent instrument for the conquest, the preservation, and the consolidation of power on the part of the leaders. Page 149. So the press is a weapon. I guess I'm just making this aside because we tend to think of the press as like this, like free expression, as just a means of sharing information. And we don't think of it as like, this is a tool for achieving power or a weapon to direct at my adversaries. A lot of what he talks about in this chapter, I'll just sort of paraphrase, like a lot of the party newsletters that would go out would be, they would have anonymous writing done for them. And what would happen is that the anonymous writer, like it's like with Reuters, for example, or like Associated Press, you'll sometimes see stories, they have no author attached to them. They just say it's by Reuters. And so what happens there is the individual writer, you're no longer looking at the credentials or the bona fides of an individual writer. You're looking at you take in the prestige of the entire organization. And anonymous work done with the stamp of approval of a given organization seems to impart that anonymous work with perhaps more gravitas than it might otherwise enjoy. But he talks about how a lot of these socialist newsletters, they would be used to make anonymous attacks on people who were maybe inconvenient for the leaders of the current party. And that there was it is more especially for the publication of violent personal attacks that anonymous journalism furnishes convenient and almost tempting opportunities, guaranteeing moral and legal impunity. Behind the shelter thus afforded by anonymity, those of base and cowardly nature are apt to lurk in order that they may launch thence in safety their poison arrows against their personal or political adversaries. The victim of aggression is thus, for many reasons, placed in a position of inferiority. Basically talks like there's not a whole lot of good ways to like address it. If you get a bunch of personal smears on your character that are anonymous, there's not a whole lot of things you can do if you don't have the platform or the prestige of the leader. And so that's yet another factor. So we first talked about, what was the first chapter called? The general stability of leadership, the financial power of the leaders, and then the press. And then chapter 4 is called the position of the leaders in relation to the masses in actual practice. So in this chapter is kind of, it's multifaceted because he goes over electoral politics, he goes over trade unions, and he goes over co-ops, and he talks about how in each one you get the factors that create a detached leadership from the rest of the party or the organization. So, for example, he basically is just sort of talking about in actual practice what's the relation of the leader to the mass. And like, so for example, in electoral politics, he says, the fact here noted indicates the essentially parliamentary character of the modern Socialist Party. The Socialist members of Parliament are those who have especially distinguished themselves in the party by their competence and by their capacity. There are two reasons for the great authority exercised by the Socialist parliamentarian. In the first place, the virtue of his position. He largely escapes the supervision of the rank and file, and even the control of its executive committee. In the second place, and even at the moment of his, In the second place, and even at the moment of his election, his dependence on the party is but indirect, for his power is derived from the electoral masses, that is to say, an ultimate analysis from an unorganized body. So yet again, where the masses gain their power is in organization, and in coming together in solidarity and forming this hierarchy with division of labor that can then act as one entity. That's the only thing you have on your side is numbers, and the only way to weaponize that and to use that as the masses for socialist ends or anything is to organize. But the general electorate outside of so the way that manifests in democratic politics is in the form of the political party, but the whole people are disorganized. Just as a rule, we're not in a liberal democracy. We are not all on the same page as to what our goals are or what we think, and most people are completely atomized into just their local, regional concerns, and with increasing levels of importance as they get to like their family and themselves. And so they're not. The electorate in general does not present itself as this organized body. But that's what he's pointing out is, so the coin of the realm in electoral political life is getting elected. And of course it would be. He's sort of pointing out inherently, once the party gets somebody elected, they have left the orbit of the rank and file of the party, at least. Now, there are a lot of reasons why they may still depend on the party, but then that puts them in an interdependence with like the other leaders of the party. But what they're sort of pointing out, what Michel's is pointing out, is that the leaders themselves become somewhat distinct from the party, because what gives them their power at that point is not the party itself; it's the electorate. And so you can have people like Joe Manchin in America, who is a Democrat who goes against his party on everything, but he gets elected in West Virginia. So the only thing that matters is that he's a Democrat that gets elected in West Virginia. He got like 67% of the vote. The last time the state went heavily for Trump, and they still voted in for this Democratic senator because he has their loyalty of the people in West Virginia. But that means that he doesn't have to answer to the base of his own party because he has left their influence, really. Okay. So he talks about trade unions. What is it? This is still about parties, but it involves the trade unions. He says, during the discussions in the Reichstag concerning the miners' strike in the basin of Ruhr in 1905, the deputy Hue, H-U-E with an accent mark over it, I have no idea how that's pronounced in German, spoke at the maximum program of the party as utopian, and in the socialist press that there was manifested no single symptom of revolt. So this is basically an elected official trying to defuse the miner strike in Ruhr Valley and dismissing their program as utopian. Just kind of pointing out how getting involved in the parliamentary system affects a more conservative temperament. Let's see here. He talks about trade union leadership. In the trade union movement, the authoritative character of the leaders and their tendency to rule democratic organizations on oligarchic lines are even more pronounced than in the political organizations. It's on page 159. In the trade union, it is even easier than in the political labor organization for the officials to initiate and to pursue a course of action disapproved of by the majority of workers they are supposed to represent. Suffices here to refer to two famous decisions of the Trade Union Congress at Cologne in 1905. In one of these, the leaders declared themselves to be opposed, in opposition to the views of the majority, to the continued observance of the 1st of May as a general labor demonstration of protest. In the second, the discussion of the general strike was absolutely forbidden. By these and similar occurrences, the oligarchical practices of the leaders are sufficiently proved, although some writers continue to dispute this fact. What does he say? Further down, for a good many years now, the executive committees of the trade union federations have endeavored to usurp the exclusive right to decide on behalf of the rank and file the rhythm of the movement for better wages, and consequently the right to decide whether a strike is or is not legitimate. And so that's one thing that happened all over the socialist world following all the communist revolutions, is that all the trade unions became managed by the party that was in charge. You had this, like in the Soviet system, yes, it was federated on some level, but that really just represented a system of organization for central control, because the trade unions ultimately were not, these were not dictatorships of the proletariat that were responsive to the needs of the workers. They were listening to Moscow. So what has happened in recent years, like in Vietnam, for example, like almost all the strikes that happen are wildcat strikes, where it's not sanctioned at all by the union leadership, because it's entirely the gumption and the initiative of the workers striking for better conditions. But the trade union leadership, which is in bed with the party, tells them, no, you don't need to strike. So, again, I said in the first video, Michel's more or less predicted the whole trajectory of how a lot of the communist revolutions were going to go. Let's see here. And then he talks about like co-ops, and like, we'll just skip that chapter. Same thing, same principles. And then also in this chapter, he talks about the personal attitude of the leaders. The democratic movement, the personal factor, this plays a very considerable part. What does he say? Okay, this part like stopped me cold, honestly. It was one of the more so than the socialists acting as an employer. This really surprised me, this whole incident here on page 164. He says, quote, "The working class leaders are well aware of their ascendancy over the masses. Sometimes political opportunism leads them to deny it, but more commonly they are extremely proud of it and boast of it. In Italy, and in other countries as well, socialist leaders have always claimed that the bourgeoisie and the government are greatly indebted to them for having held the masses in check, and as having acted as moderators to the impulsive crowd. This amounts to saying that the socialist leaders claim the merit and consequently the power of preventing the social revolution, which, according to them, would in default of their intervention have long ago taken place." And he has some citations for this. Ronaldo Regola, talking about the Italians. But yeah, okay. That's incredible to me. And I guess it's the way that he spells it out, that they have taken, that you could have leaders of socialist parties trying to claim prestige with the mainstream of the political establishment by saying, if it weren't for us, they would have revolted by now. And these are the leaders that these people have put forward and oftentimes enjoy a high level of prestige and fame and support from the rank and file. And they're saying, we're the ones keeping the rank and file in check. And so that's incredibly fascinating, but it shows you, once again, this common theme of divergent interests. The interests of the leaders are in to say that and to claim that, because that gives them it's like a veiled threat almost, that they're trying to make themselves on the principle of indispensability, which has seen them rise to the top of party life. They're trying to make themselves indispensable to the broader government as the whole and convince everyone you need us in these socialist parties as a vessel to shunt off all of that revolutionary energy where it can just be channeled into a dead end and die because we're strangling that off at the root. Which is what I would say the modern Democratic Party does to this day, is serves as a vessel for all the rage and energy that is building up, and they therefore prevent revolution thereby. And you hear similar. See, that's the thing. It's a little different. Modern Democratic Party doesn't claim to be a socialist party, so they don't. It's more striking when you're saying we're the socialist party and we're preventing the socialist revolution, which is supposed to be the end goal. Let's see how much more I have to go on this part. I'll probably just, however long it takes to get through this book, I'll do as many parts because we're not going to get to the end of this part today, and we're already at an hour, so I don't want to keep these at an hour. So next time, we'll talk about the struggle between the leaders and the masses, which is chapter 5, still in part 2. And then let's see. Okay. You do not need capitalism to get corruption in the church or any institution. That's true. What form would that corruption take? Because I think what he's saying, it's not just like what he's charting out there is that the control over the finances and therefore the control of resources and the control of the destiny of people who depend on you to have access to those resources. I mean, you could even say that the same is true in like feudalism, which is not necessarily capitalism per se, but it is in the church because it involves getting into the realm of finance. The church became an institution of finance capital, is what he's saying. And those are always driven by perverse incentives. Okay. Think how corrupt Russia and China can get. Yeah, I mean, but see, that's part of what we're talking about here is like, why did Russia and China become corrupt? It's because of these same forces in the social structure that mean what happened in Russia and China was sort of always destined to happen. That the collapse into oligarchy, the oligarchy as the anthropic force exerting itself in these so-called socialist systems until eventually a new caste of party oligarchs coalesces out of that. The Politburo became, the Kremlin became the new Romanovs. And the fact that they weren't a hereditary line doesn't really matter. As Michel says in the first part that we covered, that oligarchy really represents the domination of the living by the dead, that it is a series of ideas or an identity or a culture that is created by a group of people, and then they attempt to preserve it through their successors. There was the strategy in the past of doing that through your literal genetic successors, but that need not be the case. And in fact, you might have a better chance of finding ideological successors outside of your genetic line. And that's what they've done. And again, to reference 1984, as I did in the first section, because Goldstein's text, The Theory and Practice of Oligarchical Collectivism, I think is very influenced by Michel's. But one of the things Goldstein says in that text is that the old style of socialist fought against something called property relationships, or I forget exactly how I phrased it, but he failed to realize that what is not hereditary can still be permanent. And that's what China is. That's what Russia is. Yeah, even though Russia, that wasn't permanent. The Soviet Union, the old order of the Soviet Union was overthrown by capitalist oligarchs, basically. So capitalism did actually win out in the end in Russia. Not that they were running a good show before that, but they more or less negotiated the end of their government being sold out to corporate oligarchs. China as well has like, I guess, embraced the reality. It's just funny too. I guess I would say like libertarians have the same, absolutely the same impulse as communists do to say like, oh, well, that's not real libertarianism. Just like that's not real communism, or true libertarianism never was tried. Just like they say true communism was never tried. Because they can always point to like crony capitalism or regulations that corporate entities use. They like use the government to aid them unnecessarily, and like all these things. And they say, well, in principle, I disagree with all of that. And in my libertarian system, you would not have these crony capitalists, and therefore true libertarianism has never been tried because it doesn't measure up to my ideal. Communists can say the same thing. True communism, that wasn't really truly egalitarian. What's funny to me, they both end in oligarchy. And I think you would see the same thing if you run the libertarian experiment a bunch of times. If you allow this capitalist game to play out over however many iterations, however many generations, and allow people to attain wealth and then pass it down to their successor, whether it's genetic or otherwise, to basically you allow some minority of individuals to accrue a bunch of wealth and power and then entrench themselves holding on to it over generations, what you get eventually is some sort of, like it's like in America, corporate socialism is like what we have, more or less, where the major corporations, they socialize off all their losses. They write off their losses onto the public, and then they privatize their profits. And you can say, well, it's against my principles, but same way the communists can say, well, it was against my principles what the Politburo did. Why did those things happen? Because if you let these corporations rival the government in terms of the amount of power and wealth that they command, to the point where they can buy influence and power within the government, they are going to do that. Why? Because why wouldn't they? That's how you succeed. So that's going to happen every time. You can't stop them. You can say my principles are against that, but I guess I bring up the libertarian thing because this whole thing with Michel's that I'm starting this vlog series on is like shitting on socialism, but I don't want anyone to think it's because I'm like saying like socialism is bad, particularly bad. It's the fact that like all of our idealized notions of how we're going to escape from oligarchy, which is basically minoritarian rule by an aristocracy. They have to grapple with the reality of these social forces that Michel talks about. The whether you want to call it an iron law or not, I criticize that, but you could just call it the tendency towards oligarchy in human relations. The fact that by organization gives us power, but what that does is that it makes us go more oligarchical. You have to reckon with that. You have to deal with it. And this idea, the pie in the sky ideas of everyone's going to hold hands and sing Kumbaya and get along. Because like maybe one day we'll convince everyone of our principles and how useful it would be if they, how much more reasonable would it be, sir, if we all followed these principles? You know, like, okay, fine. Fucking explain the categorical imperative to the dude mugging you. Right? Like, like why you're not treating me as a end unto myself, which is irrational because any rule that you apply to me, you must be able to apply universally and not, well, you're going to get stabbed if you say that rather than handing over your fucking wallet, because like that's the rubber hits the road. There's eventually a material reality. And that's what I like about Michel's is talking about the material realities that cause oligarchy to happen. So I think that answers any questions or any comments anyone said in the chat. Thank you to the 3 people or 4 people. I think 4 was our max out for the stream, but maybe we'll get more as the video goes into posterity. I'll just check the Discord, see if anyone has any questions on there. But, you know, I'll answer any questions or anything you guys want to know or talk about or hear me say anything about. Any current events, I will answer it. If not, I will get off stream. Yeah, it's pretty dead. Well, all right. So you'll have to hold your question until next time, if you have another like burning question that just popped in your mind. Alrighty, thank you, everybody. I'll see you next time.